So this is BAI 101, Building a Business Dashboard. Firstly, I must make it clear that whilst I work for IBM, the opinions here are my own and nothing I say necessarily represents IBM's position, strategy or opinion. I put this video together to help anyone who's used the built-in dashboards in IBM BPM and wants to try the external dashboard capabilities in IBM Business Automation Insights. These external dashboards use Elasticsearch and Kibana, and whilst there is plenty of generic tutorial material out there, there isn't anything specific to BPM. We're going to look at the fundamentals of Elasticsearch, because once you understand how it handles documents and indexes, BAI makes much more sense and becomes much easier to use. I'll explain a simple scenario and we'll walk through the construction of a dashboard. Finally, there's some general tips and information I've learnt that you may find helpful. The first thing you're drawn to in BAI are the standard dashboards for process, case and decisions. We're very much at the dashboard level here, but you really need to start from the bottom and build up from there in order to be proficient with building your own custom dashboards. So starting at the bottom, Elasticsearch stores documents into indexes. Indexes are like database tables and documents are like rows in a table, but the structure of the table is flexible and dynamic. Now coming above the green line, we're into Kibana, which is the dashboarding component. Now Kibana has these things called index patterns that abstract a bunch of underlying Elasticsearch indexes and provide this structure for saved searches. And these saved searches filter the data. And you can see some of the search parameters that are applied here. Next we have the visualizations that visualize the data that's been filtered by the saved searches. And finally the dashboard is a container for a set of visualizations. So coming right back down to the bottom, I said that Elasticsearch stores documents. And using the Kibana dev tools, we can manipulate documents directly. So in this example, I'm putting a vehicle into the vehicle's current index, and I'm saying this vehicle is going to have an ID of 1001, and we can see the attributes of the vehicle. And when I issue that command, Elasticsearch puts one document into the vehicle current index. Now it's all dynamic. Elasticsearch doesn't care what data the vehicle contains, and it doesn't care about the index. If it doesn't exist already, it will just create it. So as well as puts, we can do fetches, we can do posts and delete. But in this example you can see I'm doing a get on a vehicle with an ID of 1002, and the underscore source just tells Elasticsearch I don't want all the metadata. And there's also search. So the open source Elastic has a funky query language. Commercial versions support SQL. But we can see here that it supports fuzzy searching. So all the text that gets indexed by Elasticsearch is processed. Using the Kibana dev console, which is shown on the left, we can issue commands directly at the underlying Elasticsearch indexes. But for Kibana dashboards, we need some structure first, and that structure is provided by index patterns. An index pattern provides a layer of abstraction over multiple underlying indexes. So over on the right we have the Kibana Discover tool, which is where we build our searches. And I've highlighted where the index pattern I want to use for this search is selected. To create an index pattern, you first have to give it a name, and that name has to be a kind of something that matches the underlying indexes that you're trying to refer to. And once you've done that, you then select any date fields that you want to use as a time filter or a primary key for the index pattern. So you can see that the name is quite restrictive, and the date that you use as the time filter is very important. So I would have created two index patterns here, one for vehicles with no time filter, and vehicles -* using the data added as the time filter. So this is what we end up with. We end up with two index patterns, vehicle star and vehicle hyphen star that look almost the same, but underneath they both refer to the two vehicles indexes, but vehicles hyphen star is using the date added as a time filter. Now you might be wondering, what has this got to do with BPM dashboards? Well, this is kind of preparing you for the structure of the indexes and index patterns that you'll see in BAI. There's a vast number of different index patterns, all using different time filters, and unless you understand the structure, it can be quite confusing. Your searches won't find the documents that you expect, and those documents won't contain the data that you thought they should. And it's all down to the way different index patterns are created, refreshed with the underlying data, and sorted according to their different time filters. Okay, so let's leave our vehicles behind now and come to BPMN Documents. Now, if I issue a GET against the underlying process summary indexes in Elasticsearch, it will return results like this. And what this tells me is that it's storing documents in a couple of different indexes: process summaries active and process summaries completed. So essentially what BAI is doing, it's maintaining two indexes for process and task data, one for active stuff and one for completed stuff. So when stuff happens to your process instance over in BAW, BAI is simply creating documents in the appropriate index and updating and deleting them as necessary. So now we understand where the data is going, we can understand a little bit about the various index patterns that are created for us by BAI and why they have such meaningless names. It's a combination of an Elasticsearch limitation and the need to provide time filters against different timestamps that exist in BPMN documents. So we've got process-summaries-star, which is indexed on start time. We've got others that are indexed on deleted time, migrated time, etc. Now they all contain roughly the same data, they're just indexed on a different time field. And this is really important because in Kibana dashboards, all the dashboards have a time filter in the top right hand corner. And obviously last 30 days, if you're using process summaries-star, that will mean the start time was in the last 30 days. If you pick the wrong index pattern and start applying time filters, you're not going to get the data that you expected. So we're over in BAW now, and this is the process diagram of the scenario I'm going to use for the dashboards. So it's a payment allocation process where payments come in from the banking team, they flow down into the accounts team who try to allocate the payments to invoices. And in most cases these invoices match the payments exactly, the dates are right, the currencies are right, and the system flows down to this system task where the systems are updated to recognize the receipt of the payment. But if there's been a problem, let's say some invoices have been consolidated together, or the payment amounts are wrong, or there's been some netting between a credit note and a debit note, the inbound payment might not match an existing invoice that's due to be paid. So it will go down this exception flow, and there'll be some routing done, and based on the initial assessment of the exception, it will go on to the accounts team for a deeper investigation, or it will go back over to the sales team. It depends on the error. There might be some missing data, or maybe an account hasn't been set up. But then hopefully these things are corrected, and then it will flow back round into allocation again and then be completed. So that's kind of the scenario that we'll use for the dashboards. So if that's our business process, what might we want to dashboard? So here's an example of one I created earlier. We might be interested in the number of active payments that we've got. We might be interested in the number that are inside the SLA or outside of the SLA. We might be interested in the total amount of payments we've got to process. We might want to see how quickly work is arriving and whether or not we're able to complete that work before the SLA expires. We might want to see the number of payments by payee, or where the different payments are in the overall process. But essentially any of the business data that we're carrying with the process, we can create dashboards against it. So just before we get into the walkthrough of the dashboard, I just want to go through some of the setup over in BAW for the process app. Now what I've done first is I've created a tracking group called TG Cache Allocation, and that tracking group has a number of tracked fields. So given a distinctive name, and it's carrying the data that I know will support my dashboards. Next, I define tracking points either at the start or the end of every activity where I want there to be some data coming out of BAW and flowing into Elasticsearch. So here we've got a receive payment task, and we've got a little flag at the bottom right hand corner that tells me this is a post tracking point. And all I'm doing is mapping the local process data into the attributes of the tracking group called TG Cache. And when I've done that, the data will be emitted by BAW and should appear in Kibana. So when we say the data should be in Kibana, there's one thing to check, especially if you're working with a new process application or you've made some changes to your tracking groups. If you go into the management tab here in Kibana and look up the index pattern that you're going to be using, so my go-to index pattern tends to be this one, process summaries -star, only because it uses process start time as a time filter. Now you see that there's 274 fields in this index pattern, and if I just scroll through some of these, you'll see that there's fields from other process applications that have been aggregated into this index pattern. So I just want to check that mine are present, so TG underscore, that's the prefix I use for my tracking group, and we can see that there is a TG cache allocation. We've got what have we got? We've got escalation team. We've basically got the characteristics from the tracking group that I'm interested in. Now if these weren't present, or if I changed them, just make sure that the index summary that you're using as the basis for your saved searches is refreshed. So you click this button, what happens is Kibana will go through all the underlying indexes and aggregate all the fields together into this index pattern, and then within this index pattern you can decide whether or not you want to use these fields. I think you can delete them. You can add scripted fields, which I won't come on to just yet. But just make sure your data is present in the index summary before you start building your saved search, because you won't find the data that you expect. So it's highly likely that the first thing you'll do when building your own dashboards will be to filter the data down to focus on your application, and this is done with a saved search. Okay, so I'm going to go over into the Discover tab where we create our saved searches. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the index pattern that's been used for this saved search to match the one that we've just confirmed contains my data. So this is process-summaries-star that keys on process start time. So I'm not seeing any data, and that's because the time filter is set to be the last 15 minutes, and I haven't, or no one's created any processes in the last 15 minutes. So if I change that to 30 days, Kibana will search the indexes and find all the process summaries for the last 30 days, or rather that have started in the last 30 days. And we can see here that there's a number of different documents, and we can expand the documents here. You can see this is a IBOR review process application document, so it's not of interest to me. So let's filter this down to my cache allocation process application. Now, because I've built this saved search previously, the frequently used fields are here for me conveniently under this kind of popular area. Obviously the first time I built this, they would have been buried down here in this alphabetical list, which does start to get quite large, but you just have to manage that. So the first thing I want to do is to make sure that the process application name is cache allocation. So if I look at this process application name field here and expand it, we can see this is the breakdown of the different the data, and it's this one I'm interested in, cash allocation. So to add that to the filter, all I have to do is click this plus icon here, and now at the top here we've now got cash allocation equal, or process application name equals cash allocation. I can open that for editing and you can see that. So process application name is cash allocation. So we're already filtering on stuff that's of interest to me. But if you look through this data, we'll see that there is a mixture of cash allocation user tasks. So here's a user task, and there'll also be process information, which is here. So I just want process information. So again, I can just click on here and have that value added to my filter. So back up the top, I'm now filtering on cash allocation, and I'm only interested in process summaries that feature a process rather than a user task. Now, if I look at another attribute of these documents, we'll see that we've got a mixture of active process instances and completed ones, because this index pattern is accessing both the process summaries active index and the process summaries completed index. Now I'm just interested in the active ones because I want to show my users all the payments that are currently running, but you might want to include both active and completed for an overall view, but you still might want to omit those that might be in an error state. So I'm going to add active to my filter, and that's starting to look pretty good now. Now the information that's presented here is all the actual document payloads. We can see we're getting this special field, the underscore source, from Elastic, and that's not particularly helpful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, see this add button here next to this field? This is the payee name. So I'm now seeing the payee name in the top level summary. What else would I want to see? Let's have a think. The payment amount perhaps, so I'll add that as well. Don't think the status is useful, but the short process instance ID, that could be handy. So that's over here. Let's move this over. So I've kind of got a summary in the saved search of the active processes that are running. This first one, doesn't have a payee name because the process has just started and that information hasn't been provided yet. But I'm going to save that now because that's started to give me the data I need. So up at the top here you'll see a save button. So I'm going to save this search. I'm going to give it a name, cache v2 active processes. Okay, and that will form the basis of my visualizations going forward. So if we have a look at the dashboard I built previously, and this was the cache dashboard active, you see the first thing I built was a metric that simply counted the number of payments that were currently in the system. If I expand that out to 60 days, we'll see some more hopefully. Yeah, so these are just simple metrics. So let's go ahead and build this metric now. So I'm going to go into the Visualize tab, and I'm going to create a new visualization, which is just going to be a simple metric. What it'll do is ask me to specify a saved search that's providing the data. So we've just created that, so cache v2 active processes. Okay, so and that's actually done. All it's done is use this metric, which is a simple count, and it's counted the number of instances. It was as simple as that. So let's save that. Okay, so we've got our first visualization. So the next visualization I'm going to add will provide a sum of all the active payments in terms of their monetary value. And I can use this one as a basis. So I'm still working on cash V2, total active payments. But I'm going to change the aggregation. Instead of it being a count, it's going to be a sum. So if I select sum, it'll ask me what fields I want to sum. And if I just type in the filter just to make that more obvious, we can see these are the two fields that would be appropriate. And I've highlighted TG cash allocation, payment amount, integer. So if I add that and click on the play button here, there we go, 104,000, which I know is about right. I'll just change the label slightly. Active payment amount. And I'll save this, but I'll save it slightly differently. I don't want to overwrite what I did previously, so I'll check this button here, save it as a new visualization, and I'll call this total active payment amount. Oops. So I'll now have two visualizations. Okay, so far we've created a couple of simple visualizations, but if you go back to the dashboard that I created previously, there's some bar charts in here. So first off, we've got a chart that's detailing who the payments are coming from. So we'll have a crack at creating that, and then we'll also do the a more complex bar chart that has a split series in it that splits between those that are inside of an SLA and those that are outside. So we'll do the simple one first, and then we'll move on to this one. So same thing again, go to Visualize, go back up to the top menu in Visualize, click New, and we're going to have a vertical bar chart. It's going to be based on our cash V2 active process safe search, and along the y-axis we want to count, so that's fine, but along the x-axis we're going to have an aggregation that's based on some of the terms in the document. So if I scroll down to terms, it'll ask me what term I want to be counting, and in my case it's the payee name that we're looking for. And there it is. So if I click that, I'll give it a label, payee, and click the play button. There we go. That's a simple vertical bar chart that's got a count on the y-axis and an aggregation of the different terms, or the payee name, on the x-axis. So let's save that, and we will call this cash V2 payments by payee. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so our final visualization is going to be another vertical bar chart, but it's going to contain a date range and a split series. And let me just explain what I'm talking about here. Within the process summaries, if I open one of them up, you can see that I'm actually emitting this value SLA breach as a string, and for most of them it's a false. When the process application breaches its SLA, this gets updated to be true, and I do that in a manual way from the process. So we want to see payments that are within their SLA and those that are outside their SLA, and we'll use this as a final kind of split on the vertical bar chart. So let's create that now. So this is the one we had previously, which was just payments by payee. So the y-axis is fine, but I want to get rid of this. my x-axis this time is going to be a date histogram, and it's asking me what field I want to use, and it's already selected the start time for me by default. So it's going to show me, let's click play now, it's going to show me process instances by their start time, but now I'm just going to add another sub bucket and split them based on those that are inside their SLA and those that are out. So if I click this button here, I have a split series, and I'm going to select a term, and the term I want is, it's got the word SLA in it, so SLA, that's given me this one, that's the one I'm looking for. And if I click play, there we go, it's split this particular one back in March, which I believe is the only one I've got in my kind of data set that's split. Okay, so I'll save that. Payments, let's call this by arrival date and SLA, and I'll save it as a new visualization so I don't overwrite the old one. Okay, so we've got our visualizations. The thing to do now is to create a dashboard to hold them all. So this is the one I created previously. This was called Cash Dashboard Active. So I'm not going to mess with that. I'll go back up to the top level and I'm going to create a new dashboard. And so here I've got a blank canvas. We can click this add button up here to add visualizations to the dashboard. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find my cash V2 visualizations. These are the ones I just built. So here we are, we've got total active payments. So that's added that first visualization that we created onto the canvas. We've got total active payment amount, so I'll add that. Then what should we have? Let's have payments by arrival date and SLA, and payments by payee. Let's just close that now. So that's how our dashboard looks just now, and we can, if we wanted to, we can rearrange some of these visualizations. So that's already, looking pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is just add another widget onto that canvas. It's not one of the visualizations because we've got the 4 that we created. Instead, this is a saved search. So if I add the cache v2 active processes, that has basically put the saved search underneath, and I can expand that over here. So we've now got, as part of the dashboard, we've got the number of payments we're processing, how much money, we've got the processes organized by their arrival date and whether they're inside or outside of their SLA, and we've got payee names. Now the thing about these dashboards is that they're kind of dynamic. So if I was to let's say select this field here, Bosch, instantly all the data flips around, and that's because Bosch has now been added at the top as a filter. So we're now filtering on our saved search for the last 60 days, but we're only looking at the stuff that where the payee name is Bosch. So that's changed that. We see that we've got the instances have changed as well, and we can just as easily remove that. So that is pretty useful. Let's save that. This is going to be our Cache v2 active dashboard. Okay, so dashboard work is complete. It's a little bit rough and ready, but there are some refinements that we can make to all of these components. And if we look at the other dashboard, cash dashboard active, we can see some of those refinements. So some of these metrics have been miniaturized. I've got a help screen here, which is basically just markup. A little bit more sophistication on the layout. I've got a saved search for the active processes, which we just built. But I've also got a task list as well. So as well as just looking at processes, I've got another saved search that contains the user tasks where their status is waiting. And right at the bottom there are a couple of maps. The one on the left shows the number of payments by geo, and the one on the right shows the value of the payments. Slightly more sophisticated visualizations, but they're just region maps, so check those out. Now we've created a few Kibana objects, we'll want to save them so we can reuse them. If I go into the Management tab and look at saved objects, there's a reason why I've adopted a certain naming convention for this stuff, and that's because it makes it possible to find it. So I've got a mixture of cache and cache v2. So if I wanted to export all the cache v2 attributes that I've created, I'd have to come up with a search term that worked, but there you go. I've got all of them, and I can now simply export all of those as a JSON file. So maybe in our world where we're switching from one VM to another, you don't want to have to recreate these dashboards. I suggest you export them because you've been able to find all the things that you've created. All the saved searches, all the visualizations, all the dashboards, you export those and then you bring them back into Kibana on another version of a VM that you're using. On that, just before you do that, before you import your dashboards and your saved searches, run a few instances of your process again and then refresh the index patterns. Then you won't get a whole bunch of errors when you open the dashboard, because it's using fields that it simply can't find in the index pattern. So run some process instances through first, update the index pattern, and then bring in your saved objects. And that's just a case of clicking on the import here and dragging the previously exported JSON file into this area. Okay, so I know the dashboard will work, or I'm confident it will work. So let's open v2, cache v2 active dashboard. That's our data. We've got this time filter set for the last 60 days, list of payees. If we go into the process portal, let's create a new cache allocation process. I've got 1042, so it should be at the bottom. I'll just use a shortcut to create something, and instead of it being a Bosch, we'll call this this is a payment from Jaguar Motors, and it's a GBP payment. It's come from GB, it's going to GB, and it is for £24,000 for some reason. And I'll click OK. So that payment's now been received, and it's waiting for allocation in the system. So back over in Kibana, nothing has changed. I've got auto refresh set, but it will still take a little while to refresh automatically. So if I just click the refresh button here, and there we go. We've got the payments gone up. We've got a big increase in payment amount, and we've got Jaguar Motors as one of the payees. The saved search is updated as well. So there you go. It's all working. So we'll finish off with some helpful info. As I've already mentioned, use a consistent naming convention for your objects. That way you'll be able to find them and save them. Often you'll create a saved search and you won't get the results that you're expecting. 9 times out of 10 this is the time filter in the top right hand corner, so just check and make sure that is including a window that's wide enough to find your processes. And if you still can't find your data, I suggest you look in the dev console, and I've got some examples of that, and compare the results that Elasticsearch has to the data that you can see in BPMN's process inspector. Now, building your visualizations doesn't always work out the way you expect. Sometimes that you've made errors. Quite often it's useful to be able to search at the Elasticsearch level to see actually what's in the documents in the index, so you can work out what the problem is. I'll upload some example files and I'll put a link in the video description. Here we've got an example of a get, which is retrieving a particular process instance of cache allocation, and over here on the right we've got a post which is actually doing a delete by query, so this will delete instance 266 of cache allocation. Maybe there was some screwy data in there, or I've refined the process app. Sometimes it's really handy to clone data or inject it retrospectively. So here I'm doing a get to find a particular process instance that I want to copy. I'm getting everything from under the underscore source field. This is the process summary payload. Then I'm changing the fields in here. I'm changing the timestamps, the process instance ID, making sure that the document ID is unique. So I've picked document ID 101. And then you can use a put command to inject that, and that, as I say, that can be handy for dashboarding in a demo. Okay, and that wraps up BAI 101. I hope you found that useful.